Already I'm going to be on a stronger ground than Mark. No, what I really want to talk about this in this paper is to talk about the question of the relationship between revolutionary activists and wider social movements. And I wrote a lot of these kind of arguments in the context of a debate about Leninism and tradition of revolutionary socialism, and that's very much my kind of standpoint. But I do want to say right at the beginning, I do think the questions that I'll be addressing are not as esoteric as that. I do think they go deeper, and I think if you care about any kind of radical revolutionary tradition, these are the kinds of questions you have to grapple with. To put it bluntly, some people agree with you and some people don't. Some of us believe what's necessary is a complete transformation of society, others that reforms are the only things that are possible or even the only things that are desirable, and some people just believe that the system's basically fine. I think faced with this, revolutionaries, we do have to make decisions about what our relationship to these people is, to the demands they make, to the political movements they engage in, and indeed to the non-politics they engage in. Actually, and in service of saying this is a more general problem than just for Leninists or for Marxists, I've been reading recently the work of the anarchist Gustav Landauer, who was a German anarchist largely in the 19th century, but then was also the Minister for Public Information in the short-lived Munich Socialist Republic after the German Revolution, which was brutally crushed, and Landauer was murdered after this was crushed. And Landauer, despite being an anarchist, speaks openly about vanguards. He talks about himself in terms of a vanguard. And in terms of, I take it as someone who has in some sense already reached a set of beliefs that he fundamentally wants the rest of the world to believe. And so although vanguard is a term that I think modern anarchists are not comfortable with, it's worth remembering that a lot of these problems remain the same nonetheless. I want to start with the following sentence, which although I have taken it from a specific source, is fairly general. You could probably find it anywhere in a lot of different discussions of Leninism. It says that a great strength of Leninism, as we understand it, is its capacity to respond to the challenge of unevenness within the working class by grouping together those workers with the most advanced ideas and arming them to intervene among wider layers within the class. Now, I think that that's a perfectly reasonable description of how people conceive of themselves as revolutionaries and why they need to be organised together. But I think the devil is in the detail here, and in particular with the phrase, the most advanced ideas. What do we mean by the most advanced ideas? What are the most advanced ideas in society? So let me start with something uncontroversial. Some of us have reached the conclusion that an alternative to capitalism is both necessary and possible, and that it will not come about through piecemeal reforms, and therefore it makes sense that we organise together to try and convince others of our ideas. What's more, we believe that such a revolution requires, as Marx puts it, the self-conscious independent movement of the immense majority in the interest of the immense majority. So not only do we have to convince others of our ideas, we have to convince them to become active and confident in promoting their own interests as part of the project of collective liberation. Incidentally, if you didn't believe that the overwhelming majority needed to be the agents of their own liberation, a lot of what I say isn't very relevant. If you believed that, as an individual you could do it yourself and liberate humanity on your own, then a lot of what I'm saying maybe doesn't apply. But let's assume that most people don't think that, and then in some sense we have to mobilise the rest of humanity in the interests of themselves. And therefore all the more reason in that case for us to be organised. And at least this is one sense in which we can say our ideas are the most advanced. We've reached conclusions that we believe everyone else must at some stage reach, and we want to convince people and bring them to those conclusions ourselves. And I think it's worth stressing at this point, that that's not politically irrelevant. Believing that there needs to be a revolution is a historically important moment. The history is full of examples where movements that were potentially revolutionary were not revolutionary precisely because they didn't believe they were revolutionary, or they didn't believe they needed to be revolutionary. My favourite, tragic example of this, I think, is actually the Solidarity movement in Poland in 1981. It's hard to think now that the most significant independent trade union, possibly in European history, was built in a country that looks now like modern Poland. And yet this was a huge organisation, rooted in communities, capable of engaging in long factory occupations, capable of moving actually into rural communities. There was a rural solidarity. Solidarity was part of the fabric of Polish life, and actually did point towards an alternative ways of how Polish society could have been organised differently, precisely because it was based on collective organisation of workers within the workplace. At the point that Solidarity was at its height, to be blunt, Solidarity could have run Poland, not the Communist Party. But it's absolutely crucial in that case that the leaders of Solidarity Communist Party, they saw themselves consistently as compromising, attempting to win reforms, and then at various key stages held back. And we know, I don't know if we know, but within a year martial law was declared, solidarity never reached the heights it did, and so come 1980, come 7 or 8 years later, when the decrepit Stalinist regime does collapse, the only real option on the table at that point appears to be capitalist restoration. And so it does, it does matter to declare oneself a revolutionary. But I don't think it's the only sense in which we can talk about people having the most advanced ideas. A different sense in which our ideas might be the most advanced is in theory. For example, I believe that Marxism offers a framework in which to understand the operations of the capitalist system, make general claims about its strengths and weaknesses, where do we strike and where do we leave them alone, and identify the points at which the system might begin to fracture and we might be able to build an alternative. And when our theory is good, it can help us understand the dynamics of the system in order to know where to focus our energies, to anticipate and respond to events. Sometimes we can make predictions, and even sometimes they work out the way we say, although it's worth bearing in mind there's this old joke, Trotskyists have predicted 7 of the last 3 recessions, and it's always worth remembering that when thinking of, we do have to check how predictively powerful our theory is sometimes, rather than assuming it is. I wonder if anyone has ever drawn up a proper balance sheet of that sort of thing. But these ideas are important. They inform practice, they're tested in confrontation with reality, and having the right theory does matter. And again, in that sense, you could talk about that as being the most advanced ideas. But then thirdly, and I think probably most significantly, there's what might be called, for want of a better word, practical consciousness. This is the kind of knowledge, I think, that doesn't precede practice, doesn't come before practice, but proceeds from it. It's the kind of consciousness acquired by being at the sharpest end of the struggle against the existing system, and especially the kind of ideas that develop through scoring victories against that system. I'm going to take a quotation from what might be considered quite strange to us, is the Aristotelian philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, who, although was a Marxist in his youth, is certainly not really one anymore, although you read some of his recent stuff, I think he's kind of discovering some more radicalism again. And he poses the question, how does someone become a revolutionary? And he says, only, I believe, by the experience of concurrently trying to make and remake the badly needed institutions of everyday life through grassroots organisation, trade unions, cooperatives, small businesses that serve neighbourhood needs, schools, clinics, transport systems and the like, so that they may serve the common good, and by doing so, learning that only by breaking with the political norms of the status quo can the relevant common goods be achieved. Those who engage in such making and remaking will encounter that resistance to any breach of those norms, which is the characteristic response of the established order. It is that resistance that makes revolutionaries. And I think that it's a process like that actually that Marx has in mind when he writes in the German Ideology about revolutionary practice being, it's only through revolutionary practice that the working class can concede in ridding itself of the muck of ages and becoming fitted to found society anew. The idea is that it's only through a certain process of confrontation and resistance with the existing system that we become capable of genuinely transforming it. And I think that kind of consciousness too can be described as involving the most advanced ideas. I think actually something like this consciousness is what Lenin uses to describe the vanguard in his famous and often misunderstood pamphlet Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. So Lenin is often represented as defending an elite, militarized conception of a party who can liberate the masses and act on their behalf. Yet in this pamphlet, he's attacking any conception of discipline, which is not ultimately connected with people involved in day-to-day struggles. This is Lenin speaking. The first questions to arise are, how is the discipline of the proletariat's revolutionary party maintained? How is it tested? How is it reinforced? First, by the class consciousness of the proletarian vanguard, and by its devotion to the revolution, by its tenacity, self-sacrifice and heroism. Second, by its ability to link up, maintain the closest contact, and, if you like, merge, in certain measure, with the broadest masses of working people, primarily with the proletariat, but also with the non-proletarian masses of working people. And that's more of a serious thing in Russia than probably is for us now, but there is not a mass peasantry in this country that I'm aware of. Third, by the correctness of political leadership exercised by this vanguard, by the correctness of its political strategy and tactics, provided the broad masses have seen from their own experience that they are correct. Without these conditions, discipline in a revolutionary party, the party of the advanced class, whose mission it is to overthrow the bourgeoisie and transform the whole of society, cannot be achieved. Without these conditions, all attempts to establish discipline inevitably fall flat and end up in phrasemongering and clowning. They are created only by prolonged effort and hard-won experience. Now it strikes me that here it's incredibly important to note that, first of all, it's the mass of workers in their everyday struggles that impose discipline on the party, and not the other way around. Generally speaking, that's how Lenin is often read. That it's the working class itself that imposes the discipline on the party, and they are necessary for that discipline. Secondly, that the party really only makes sense at all, remember phrasemongering and clowning, if it's connected to the day-to-day struggles of the working class. And moreover, finally, I think, at least from this passage in Lenin, it's pretty clear the vanguard in this situation is not the same thing as the party, or at least certainly not the same people who consider themselves self-declared explicitly revolutionaries. Indeed, this is an entire pamphlet about why lots of people around Europe who declare themselves to be revolutionaries aren't really revolutionaries because they're just actually play-acting a revolution. So before I give you the punchline of why I'm making all these distinctions, I think it's worth pointing out there is, of course, it's wrong to think about these things as three distinct and separate conceptions. They interrelate, they inform one another. It's a fairly obvious point that I've said that believing in the need for a revolution is going to be connected to some sort of revolutionary theory. You don't just dream it up off the top of your head, generally speaking. But moreover and more importantly, revolutionary theory, if it's to be any good, will build on the third sense of most advanced ideas. The kinds of consciousness that people gain through practice, the kinds of experiences that are learned through challenging the existing system, have to inform and developing a new theoretical practice. This is a concrete example of this you find in Marx's reaction to the Paris Commune in 1871. Before 1871, Marx has a fairly ambiguous, ambivalent attitude towards the state. Sometimes he seems to imply that the working class socialism can come sort of through the state, not only through the state, but through winning victories in the state and so on. And it's the experience of the Paris Commune, the experience of seeing the French state crush the Commune in the most bloody way possible, that leads Marx to then conclude that the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. Lenin makes this point too about revolutionary theory, but I need to turn to the right page. He talks about how the creation of a revolutionary party is facilitated by a correct revolutionary theory, which in its turn is not a dogma, but assumes final shape only in close connection with the practical activity of a truly mass and revolutionary movement. So this really brings me now to my reason for making these three distinctions. And remember that this is largely, these remarks were largely made in a discussion internal to a debate amongst Marxists and Leninists, although, as I say, I do think there's a broader relevance. It seems to me that one of the greatest risks of contemporary Leninism, and I think I might go further into, say, of radical politics in general, is to confuse these three senses of the most advanced ideas, and in particular to think that the first two are sufficient for the third. To declare oneself a revolutionary is not meaningless, but we should not fall into the trap of thinking that doing so grants us automatic access to the kind of ideas which can only be formed through struggle. Correct theory is essential, but is not the same as practical consciousness, and even though they ought to be able to both inform and learn from one another. To forget this, I think, risks elevating an abstract commitment to revolution or a particular theoretical position to a prerequisite of leadership, and to risk ending up, as Lenin puts it, in phrasemongering and clowning. In fact, I think we can go further. Not only are the first two not sufficient for the third, they may not even be necessary. To be the most advanced in terms of a class consciousness formed through struggle may not involve a formal, explicit commitment to revolution, though, for the reasons I said, I do think it's essential in the long term. Marxists have always been alive to the ways in which the revolutionary content of events can exceed their apparently reformist form, even despite the explicit commitments of their participants. The most revolutionary elements may not be those who declare themselves to be revolutionaries. And this is important, I think, because given the state of the left in Britain and actually in most of the world, whatever a revolutionary vanguard is that's going to develop these most advanced ideas, it's unlikely to find itself within any particular organisation. Lenin talks about how the conditions of discipline, etc., are created only by prolonged effort and hard-won experience. In Britain, and I think in large parts of the world, I think what we have is a number of relatively small radical groups. Some are growing, some are shrinking. I think, can shortcut this and declare itself to be that actually existing revolutionary party without, to be blunt, looking a bit silly. I think that, so the American socialist Paul LeBlanc actually, so these ideas were originally written as a kind of response to Paul LeBlanc, but that's why he kind of comes in at the end. I think he offers a very sensible kind of starting point for that discussion and that process. He says, I think it's important for our different groups of the socialist left not to rush into hothouse efforts to forge some premature organisational unity. Instead, we should focus on working together in real, practical struggles with an eye towards possible unity, but with a focus on the actual struggles. Those struggles are the necessary transformative precondition for possible unity. The only fruitful unity will come on the basis of joint action in such real, practical struggles. And that's, I suppose, where I hope sort of to follow on from what Mark was saying, that it's our task, it seems to me, to identify what those struggles are, where the kinds of questions, the kinds of demands that can point beyond our particular situation can be raised, the kinds of things that McIntyre talks about that can raise the bigger questions of what is good for humanity, as it were, maybe not in that language if you don't like that language, but that's McIntyre's language, that cuts against, that in some way cuts against the particular limited world we live in at the moment. Now, just to say, to end, as one practical thing about this, in Britain right now we're faced with an attempt to reconfigure the public sector, which creates the urgent need for defensive struggles. The public sector is being completely transformed around us, and there are defensive struggles, and they're sometimes winning, but actually the defensive struggles are nowhere near up to the task. But also, what that process also does is force us to ask big political questions. What should our public services be for? What should our public services look like? What is education for? What is education? Who knows best what working class communities need? I suspect it's not us, but I suspect it's not some Labour think tank either. It's probably working class communities themselves. These are not just questions for the people whose particular jobs, wages, pensions and so on are at stake. They're questions for the whole of our society. And I think being part of and advancing a nationally coordinated but also locally